She was 18, and the state was finished with her. The younger kids at the group home were getting families, houses, last names to keep. Paige Doughty got a garbage bag, $40, and a signed paper for a $5 lobster shack on the wrong side of Carvers Harbour. Hers for $5 and 2 summers of unpaid work. A wreck nobody down at the co-op would sign for. The roof sagged, the sills were soft, the whole shed leaned out over the water on rotten pilings, and at high tide, the sea came up grey through the gaps in the floor. That was what she owned. That was the whole of it. No people, no address that would hold, and a Maine winter already coming on across the bay. Now carry that with you, because within a year, that leaning wreck nobody in the harbour wanted was worth more than every home the other kids had been handed. Not the building. The building stayed junk. It was something the last man to haul from that shack had tied up and left in the rafters, wrapped and waiting in the dark. And I will get you to it, but not yet. He locked the place. He walked down the wharf a final time, and he left something up there for whoever hauled next. So here is the question I want you to hold. How does the one thing a whole harbour turned its back on end up worth more than everything the placed kids got? And what did the last man out of that shack leave hanging in the rafters for the next pair of hands? Let me take you back to the day the state let go of her, because it tells you what she was walking away from. And on that island, it turned out to be the same direction as what she was walking toward. It was a Tuesday. The exact date the records will not give me cleanly. I am working from a co-op waybook, a headstone, and the way the island tells it, so where I am guessing, I will say so. There was a group home over on the Rockland side of the bay. A big, tired house that smelled of floor cleaner and other people's laundry, and under that, the cooked onions smell that gets into the walls of any place where too many people eat too many cheap suppers in a row. A caseworker drove her to the ferry terminal. On her lap was a black contractor's bag with everything she owned inside it, and it did not weigh much. 18. That was the whole of the paperwork. At 18, the file closes, the checks stop, the bed goes to the next kid on the list, and the state wishes you well. The younger ones she'd shared a bathroom with were being fostered into houses with a dog and a spare room, handed names that would follow them clean onto a diploma. Paige got a handshake and a phone number for a shelter she never called. What she had instead of people was a piece of paper, and the paper was for a building. 2 summers running, she had worked the counter at the bait and hardware store out on Vinalhaven, across the water, and the woman who ran the Lobster co-op down on the wharf had watched her do it. Dolores Calderwood, manager of the Down Street co-op, going on 20 years, the kind of woman who can look at a barrel of shorts and a man's face at the same time and tell you which one is lying. The co-op had a derelict on its books it could not get rid of, a shack out on the far end of Cobb Ledge Wharf, tide coming up through the floor, that no licensed man in that harbour would take even for nothing. So Dolores made her the offer you only make to somebody with nowhere softer to land. $5 for the shack. And 2 summers of unpaid work for the co-op after. Bait, sorting, hauling, whatever came, to square what the place still owed against it. It's a wreck, she told the girl, and did not dress it up one word. Pilings are half gone, roof's a colander, but it's a roof, and it's over the water, and that's a berth, which is more than most get handed. You want it or not? She wanted it. $40 in her pocket, a garbage bag at her feet, a winter 6 weeks out, and a wreck over the water is still a roof over your head. The harbour had opinions. the way a harbour does. Word went round that the Doughty girl had taken the co-op's garbage for $5 and thought she'd been done a kindness. Maybe it was garbage. She counted her $40 twice on the crossing, and it did not grow. Winter was coming. She owned a leak. Now, before the ferry gets her across, you should understand why her hands were not afraid of any of it. Because it matters later, and because a person does not walk into that kind of work off the street. Those 2 summers behind the counter were not nothing. A bait and hardware store on a lobster island is a schoolroom if you keep your ears open, and she kept hers open. She learned what a lobster gauge is, the brass measure a man runs across a carapace to say keep it or throw it back, and why he carries a spare in his oilskin. She learned what a V-notch is, the little wedge cut into the flipper of an egg-bearing female that means, put me back, I am a breeder, protected by the law and by the men themselves. And she learned that the paint on a boy is not decoration. The colors are a name. Every pattern on every boy is registered to one license, filed with the state, and you no more paint another man's colors and set them than you would sign his name to a check. That is the first thing that surprises people about this work. It is romance from the shore and a rule book up close. The co-op weighs you, the state licenses you, the harbour watches you, and the wait for a license of your own can run years. She knew that already. She had rung it up over the counter 2 summers running. The knots she taught herself. There was a thin blue library book with diagrams, and she took it a page at a time on slow afternoons at the register. Bowline, clove hitch, the eye-splice in 3-strand line, working a fid through the lay until her fingers bled, and then until they stopped bleeding. Nobody stood over her to teach it. She was not raised into this the way island children are, standing in a father's cockpit before they can read. She came at it sideways, out of a book and a job, because those were the doors that happened to be standing open. Of the years before, there is less to tell, and less that she told. A childhood in and out of the system. Foster to group home to foster. The kind of file that gets thick and says nothing. A mother somewhere who is not in this story, and not because I am keeping her out of it. She is simply not in it. She left, or was made to leave, and the record cannot keep its own accounts straight on which. No people to fall back on. Paige carried that fact the way other people carry a wallet, always without thinking about it. And it is the reason a leaking shack on the wrong side of a harbour looked to her like something worth having. It was hers. Nobody could put her out of it. The sea could come up through the floor twice a day, and it was still, every inch of it, hers. The ferry out of Rockland runs about an hour and a quarter in fair weather, and the weather that day was the ordinary grey of Penobscot Bay. I have made that crossing. You stand at the rail, and the mainland goes soft and low behind you, and for a while there is only water, the colour of a worn nickel, and then the islands begin to come up out of the fog, a shoulder at a time, dark with spruce, hemmed in granite the tide has rubbed round. Diesel and salt, and the cold coming up off the water. Gulls working the wake. It is not a pretty ride so much as an honest one, and it does something to a person to watch the last road on earth slide down under the horizon behind them. She came across on the morning boat in late September. No, it was into early October by then. The co-op waybook still holds the day she first signed her name in it, and I trust the book over my own arithmetic. Carvers Harbour is the working harbour on the south end of Vinalhaven, and it is a real place, not a calendar photograph. Lobster boats and draggers moored gunwale to gunwale, bait barrels sweating in the cold, the fuel float riding low, and a smell over the whole of it that is nearly a solid thing you could lean against. She stepped off with her bag and her $40, asked the way to Cobledge Wharf, and a man pointed with his chin and did not break stride. The shack was everything the paper promised, and less. 12 feet by 16, give or take a foot, and I would not swear to the foot. One room, set out over the water on 6 pilings that had been driven, I would guess, before she was born, and eaten at from underneath by the tide every year since. It leaned. Not a little. It leaned the way a tired man leans on a lamppost, fully committed to it, and the shingles had gone the soft, silver black of wood that has quit arguing with the rain. At the low water line, you could read the green weed and the barnacle crust climbing the posts, and above that, the high mark where the sea came, and the high mark was too high. The water got into that building twice a day, every day, on the tide. She stood on the wharf and looked at it and said nothing for a good long while. There was an old man on the next float over, coiling line into a tub. 70s, though on that island the weather planes the age off a face and nails 10 years back on somewhere else, so I would not swear to the number any more than to the shack's dimensions. Behind him sat a boat, the Erna B, wood-hulled, kept the way a man keeps the thing he means to be buried near. He watched her look at the shack. He did not offer to help, and he did not offer sympathy, which on that wharf is nearer to respect than either would be. After a while he spoke. "Nobody's hauled off Cobledge in a good few years," he said. "Not since the old fella that had it passed on." He nodded at the pilings without getting up. "Sills are gone under her. Get down there a dead low and see what you've actually got. Out here, the tide runs your day, not the clock." Then he looked at her hands, not her face. "And you know the colours have to be registered. You don't just paint a buoy and set it. That's the co-op's business, and the state's, before it's ever yours." Down on the co-op float, a heavy-set man had stopped his work to watch. Ozzie Trundy, 58, and they called him the Scale, because he would run another man's catch across his own certified plate and stand there while it dripped, rather than take a soul's word for a pound. He looked at the girl and the garbage bag and the leaning shack, and he did the arithmetic out loud to the man beside him, not quite quiet enough to miss. City kid, foster kid, won't last the first blow off the water. He had watched them come with romance in their heads, and he had watched the water send every last one of them home to the mainland. He turned back to his barrels. He had already weighed her and set her aside. She asked the old man his name. "Skoog," he said. "Eldon Skoog." She said, "Mr. Skoog, how deep does it get under there at high water?" And he told her, plain, to the foot. That was the whole of the first conversation. He did not tell her she could do it. He did not tell her she couldn't. He told her the depth of the water and went back to his line. And on Cobledge Wharf, that is nearer to kindness than it has any business sounding. She had hours to wait before the tide would let her look, because the tide does not care what your schedule is, and that was the first thing the water made her learn. You do not pick the hour. The bay decides when you may see under your own house, and you wait on it, or you learn nothing. So she sat on the wharf, with her bag between her boots, and watched Carvers Harbour drain down around the pilings, mud and weed and old rope coming up grey into the cold light. And she made herself useful the only way she could just then, which was to look hard and keep her mouth shut and let the sea uncover what she had signed for. When the water had gone off far enough, She climbed down into the mud and got under the shack, and what she found was about what Eldon had told her she would find. 6 pilings, 2 of them sound. 2 she could save if she got to them before the frost, and 2 that were candy, punk soft, the kind of wood you can push a thumb into like it was cheese, and the sills those 2 carried had let go at the corners, so the whole floor rode on a lean. She did not stand there and despair over it. She catalogued it. This piling, that sill, this corner first, before the frost. A shack is a system, and a system you can understand can be fixed if you take it in the order the water allows, and not the order your fear wants to take it in. She came back up with mud to the elbow and a list in her head, and that was the first good hour she had had in longer than she would have said. The door was swollen tight in its frame, seized on years of damp, and it did not want her. She set her shoulder to it, and it gave a half-inch and stuck. She backed off and hit it lower, down near the sill where the swelling was worst, and on the 3rd try it tore loose of its own frame, with a sound like a wet knuckle cracking, and swung in on one live hinge and one dead one. The smell came out to meet her, cold and salt and tar, and under those, the dry brown smell of a place shut up a long time. Bait and pine pitch and the ghost of pipe smoke soaked so deep into the boards it had become part of the wood itself. Nobody had breathed that air in years. Inside was one room, and the room had been left, not emptied. That is a different thing, and she felt the difference before she could have told you what it was. There was a plank bench along one wall, worn pale, where a man had sat 10,000 times to mend gear. Traplath stacked and gone grey. A coil of tarred ground line hung on a peg, still supple, still oiled, hung the way a careful man hangs line he means to come back to. A gauge on a nail by the door, the brass gone dark. A single mug on a shelf turned upside down, clean. Whoever had shut this place up had not fled it. He had squared it away. He had put his tools where his own hand would know to find them in the dark. And then he had gone. And I think, though I cannot prove it off any page, that some part of him meant to come back and never did. She stood in the doorway and let the light do its slow work across the floor. Late afternoon, October, the sun already going long and orange through the one salt-blind window over the water. It reached in and laid a bar of light along the boards and up the far wall, and where it climbed, she saw the rafters for the first time, low and rough-sawn, close enough over her head to touch. And on the pegboard by the door, under the gauge, hung a padlock. Not on the door, on a hatch. Set low into the floor at the back of the room, over the deepest part of the crossing, where the water ran under, even at dead low, there was a hatch cut into the planking, a square of floor with a recessed iron ring and a hasp, and through the hasp a padlock, and the padlock was rusted the deep red of iron that has breathed salt air for years without a key turned in it. She crouched over it. A man does not lock the floor of a shack he is walking away from for good. Not unless there is something under it. He did not want the tide, or the next hands, to come by too easily. The lock was seized solid, the shackle welded into its own body by the rust, and she had nothing on her to force it, and the light was going fast now, off the water. She knelt there a moment, with her hand flat on the cold hatch, and then she looked up. Not for any reason she could have named. The way a person looks up in a strange room when the light shifts, and something in the corner of the eye says, "Look." Up in the rafters over the bench, back where the roof met the wall in shadow, in the last of the orange coming off the water, There was something wedged across two of the beams. A long bundle, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff and grey with age, lashed at both ends with tarred line, set up there deliberately, out of the reach of the tide and out of the reach of a person standing flat on the floor. She could just make out the shape of it, longer than her arm, bound like something a man had wanted kept. She reached up on her toes, and her fingers came a hand's width short of it in the dark, and the light went off the water, and the room went to shadow, and whatever it was stayed up there in the rafters, waiting, the way it had waited for whoever hauled next. Morning came in grey and honest over Carvers Harbour, and the tide had gone out in the night, and Paige was awake before it was fully light, because the cold off the water does not let you sleep in. She had spent the first night in her sleeping bag on the plank bench, and she had not gone at the rafters in the dark, because you do not reach for a bound thing over your head by feel with the water running under the floor. You wait for light. The bay had taught her that already. So she made coffee on a camp stove, and she watched the window go from black to slate to a thin, working grey. And when she could see the beams, she went and found a fish crate and set it under the bundle, and stood up on it and brought the thing down slow with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, and it smelled of tar and old canvas and something mineral under that, like a coin held too long. The oilcloth had gone stiff as board. The tarred line lashing the ends was still sound, still supple where the tar had kept it, and she picked the knots loose rather than cut them, because a man who lashes a bundle that carefully has earned having his knots respected. She peeled the oilcloth back on the bench in the grey light, and there they were. Buoys, a whole bundle of them, wooden, the long spindle kind that ride the swell, 8 or 10 of them, nested and tied, and under the grime the paint was still bright. One pattern, over and over, a band of deep green, a band of white, a red top. The same 3 marks on everyone, laid down by the same hand across years, touched up and touched up again. She rubbed a thumb across the nearest, and the grime came away and left green under her nail. And there, on the shaft of the buoy, where the paint went thin, was a name, in a careful block letter that had been redone as often as the colours. A. Sanborn. She sat down on the bench with a green and white buoy in her lap and did not move for a while. She had signed a paper for a $5 wreck. She was holding one man's whole working life in her 2 hands, and it was worth more than the building it had waited in, and I told you it would be. She did not know his name yet, or she knew only the paint of it. She would learn the rest. But she understood the size of what she was holding before she understood a single fact about the man. And that is the part I keep coming back to. There was a step on the wharf outside. A man put his head in at the broken door, saw her sitting there with the boys, and did not remark on it. Gideon Dyer, a carpenter and rigger who kept a shop 3 floats down, sent by Dolores, he said, to look at her pilings before she killed herself under there at the wrong tide. He was a big, slow-spoken man with sawdust in the cuffs of his jacket, and he looked at the sag of the floor and the punk in the sills, the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, without alarm and without comfort. "You've got 2 good posts, and 2 you can save and 2 that are done," he said. "We sister the sills before frost, or you lose the corner. You know what sistering is?" She said she did. "Good. Then you'll hand me things and I won't have to explain them." That was the whole of the hiring. If you're finding something in this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep telling ones like it. And tell me down in the comments, Have you ever found something left behind by a stranger that changed how you looked at your own life? I'd like to know. Now let me get back to the shack, because before she could get to what was under the floor, she had to keep the floor from falling into the sea. The work came in an order the tide set, not the clock, and she learned to think in low water. Gideon showed her once and made her do it after. You cut your sister timber to length, pressure-treated, and you set it hard against the old rotten sill and through-bolt the two together so the sound wood carries the load the punk wood dropped. You do it at dead low, with the mud sucking at your boots and the whole bay draining past your knees, because that is the only window the sea gives you. 4 hours if you are lucky, and then it comes back for the room, whether you are finished or not. She caulked the worst of the deck seams with cotton and a caulking iron, driving the strand down into the crack and paying it with a thin roofing tar, so the twice-daily flood came up less and less. She chinked the wall gaps. She ran a power sander over the bench and the shelf until the wood came up honey-coloured and clean. And then the line. There was tarred 3-strand ground line coiled on the peg, and a length of it had chafed through where it crossed the piling, and Gideon watched her take the 2 ends and not tie them, but splice them. She unlaid 3 strands on each side, married them, and worked a fid through the lay, over one and under one, tuck after tuck, rolling the splice tight against her thigh, and when she was done, she cut the tails and rolled it under her boot on the floor and handed it up without a word. Gideon turned it over and looked at the tucks. "Where'd a foster kid learn a 3-strand eye splice?" he said. He did not mean it unkind. She said, "A library book." He grunted. "It's a good splice," he said, and that was worth more to her than the $10 he did not charge her. Now the hatch. It was set low in the floor at the back, over the deep of the crossing, and it had been locked, and the lock had been rusting there long enough that the shackle had welded into its own body. She had no key and no bolt cutter. She had a hacksaw with 2 good teeth left in the blade. And she got down on her knees over the hatch with the water running dark and quick beneath the planks, and she started to cut. It is slow work, cutting a rusted shackle by hand. The blade binds, the rust packs the teeth. You cut and clear, and cut and clear, and the iron dust comes up red and gets in the wet of your gloves, and the tide comes up under you while you do it, so that the smell of the sea gets stronger the longer you kneel there. She cut through the first side of the shackle, and the lock did not open, and she started on the second, and somewhere in there the light shifted a full hour, and she did not notice. The tin was already open on the bench, and she was standing very still, reading, when Gideon came back at noon, and stopped in the doorway, and read her face, and said nothing, and left again. Under the hatch there had been a dry pocket, a shelf of ledge, granite, up above the highest reach of the tide, even at the spring floods, a little dry cave in the floor of a shack that flooded twice a day, and a man had found it and used it, and known it would stay dry when nothing else in the building would. In it sat a tin. A flat rectangular tin, the old kind, a T-brand pressed into the lid under the rust, the sort that has not been sold in that packaging in longer than Paige had been alive. And beside it, standing on its edge in a fold of waxed paper, an envelope. She opened the tin first. Inside, dry as a church, were pages. Small ruled pages, filled edge to edge in a cramped upright hand that never once slanted, held with a rubber band that fell to dust when she touched it. They were catch records, month by month, year by year, beginning in 1962 and running to 1981. and I have held these pages, so let me tell you what one of them says, because a single page tells you the whole of the man. October, 1970. So many traps hauled, so many pounds of lobster, written out in a careful hand, 1,140 pounds. The price that fall, 95 cents the pound. The weather in 4 words. Ice early in the cove. And down at the bottom of the month, not every month, but some, a line that was not arithmetic. On that page, it read only, Iris would have liked the run of it. That is all. He kept his books like a man squaring accounts with something larger than the co-op, and once in a while, the account was not about lobster.
Then the envelope.
On the front, in the same upright hand, gone brown with the years, to whoever hauls next. It was sealed. It had been sealed a long time. She sat on the bench and worked it open along the top with her thumb so as not to tear the writing, and she unfolded 2 pages, soft as cloth at the creases. And she read what a man had set down for a person he would never meet.
To whoever hauls next.
If you are reading this, then I am gone off the water one way or the other, and the shack is yours. Or you have taken it, which out here comes to the same in the end. I do not know your name. I have thought about you more than you would guess for a man I will never shake hands with. I have decided to leave you the truth as I have it, and a few things worth more than the roof, which does leak, and I am sorry for that. I patched her every fall, and she leaked every spring. Some things you only keep ahead of. You do not fix them. The colors are green and white with a red top. They are registered to my license, and when I am gone, that lapses, and you cannot use them, and you should not, and I want to tell you why, so you are not tempted. A man's colors are his name on the water. When you see green and white and red on the swell, every man in this harbour knows whose string that is and leaves it alone. And that whole arrangement rests on nobody ever painting another man's colours. It is older than the license, and it is stronger than the law. Register your own. Pick something the water can read in fog. Earn the harbour learning it. Do not shortcut onto mine. The boys in the rafters are yours to keep, but not to set. Keep them to know that a man was here before you and did it square. The gauge by the door is true. I checked it against the warden's own more than once. Measure every one and put the shorts back, and it will cost you money this year and pay you back the rest of your life. The V-notch is the same. You throw back a notched female with eggs, and you will feel the fool with an empty tank and a winter coming. And you do it anyway, because the whole ground is a garden and not a mine. And the men who forgot that fished it flat and starved and deserved to. I have cut the notch into more breeders than I have kept, and I have never once been sorry. There is a dog under the spruce out back. His name was Bosun, and he was a good one. The flat stone is one I carried up myself, and I would take it kindly if you left it where it is. The rest you will learn from the water, and from Skoog, if he is still above the ground when you come, and he will not say much, which is how you will know it is worth hearing. I built nothing here that was mine alone. The ground was lent to me, and I am lending it on. Haul square. Throw back what the law and your own conscience says, throw back. And when your time comes, leave the next one better than the roof I left you. A.J. Sanborn. There was no date, or there had been one, and the damp had taken it. The ink at the corner has bled to a bruise you cannot read. I have held that page. The paper is soft as old flannel at the folds, and it wants to come apart in your hands, and you find yourself holding it flat on the bench the way you would hold something breathing. He wrote it not knowing the next hands would belong to an 18-year-old girl with $40 and no people. And I do not think it would have changed a word of it if he had known. He was not writing to a person, he was writing to the ground, and to whoever the ground got next. That is the thing that was worth more than every placement the other kids were handed. Not the tin, not the bright boys. A working line, a set of colors done the right way, a name on the water, and a dead man's trust handed forward to whoever proved they would carry it square. You cannot foster that. You cannot sign a state paper for it. She sat in a flooding shack she had bought for $5, and she held the deed to something the placed kids would never be given, and she was the only one who knew it yet. She asked Mr. Skoog about him the next morning, standing on the float while he coiled line, and the old man was quiet long enough that she thought he had not heard. Then he said the name. Averill Sanborn. He set the coil down. Fished off Cobb Ledge the best part of 20 years. Iris May, she was called. His boat, after his wife. He looked out at the water where the man's string used to be. Averill did 2 years in the Coast Guard when he was young and never said 3 words about it. Lost Iris in '75, I think it was. And after that he fished, and he kept that dog, and he did not say much to anybody. And what he did say, you could set your watch by. He glanced at Paige. Careful, man. Everything's squared away. The kind that locks the floor of a shack so the sea can't have his books. He almost smiled. Guess he wanted somebody to have them, just not the sea. Later that week, an old fellow off the tug Ironbound, Cyrus Bunker, who had towed for the co-op 40 years and remembered everyone, filled in the corners while she loaded bait. He remembered the dog. Osen, a black and tan of no particular breed, that rode in the Iris May's cockpit in all weather and was buried, when his time came, under the big spruce behind the shack, under a flat piece of granite Averill had carried up from the shore on his own back because, Cyrus said, he wasn't going to mark a good dog with beach gravel. Cyrus looked at her a moment. He'd have hated the fuss anybody made over him, he said, and he'd have wanted somebody to keep hauling off that ledge. Empty water's a sad thing to an old man. He climbed back aboard the tug and left her standing there with a bait bag in each hand, and more than she could hold in her chest. The harbour came one at a time after that, and never all at once, and never out of anything you could call warmth. It came because she had come out on the morning boat and asked the depth of the water before she asked for help, and put her shorts back and did not make a noise. Marilyn Airy came first, a widow from up the Maine road with a face like a folded map, and she came with a blueberry pie and a jar of fish chowder and set them on the bench, and looked at the sistered sills and said, "Well, you're not just playing at it," and left before Paige could thank her, which is how that generation gives a gift, by getting out of the room before you can spoil it with gratitude. Dolores let her run bait and rope on the co-op's book that first month, a little owing against the 2 summers still owed, because a girl cannot fish for the money to buy the gear she needs to fish for the money. She said it flat, no kindness in her voice, all of it in the act. "You'll pay it back off the top before you see a nickel," she said. "That's not a favor, that's a ledger." And she wrote the girl's name in the book in her own hand, which was the favor, whatever she called it. There was a young man about her own age, Tobias Lund, who sterned for one of the bigger boats and had a laugh you could hear across the harbour, and he came by on a slack afternoon and showed her the thing a book cannot teach, which is how to haul a trap without breaking your back or your boat. Gaff the buoy, throw the line over the hauler, let the block do the lifting, catch the trap on the rail, swing and set it in one motion so the boat does not roll you into the drink. He made her do it with an empty trap on the wharf until it was smooth. He did not want anything for it. He liked her plainly, and he liked her the honest way, as a person who was game, and he became the nearest thing to a friend she had on that island, and I will not pretend that meant nothing to a girl who had none. Constance Webber, who kept Webber's General Store up the hill, sold her an oilskin off the discount rack, a good used one, cracked at the elbow but sound, and let her carry it on account against the season. "Pay me at Christmas," Constance said. "If you're still here at Christmas." She said it dry, testing, and Paige said, "I'll be here." And Constance rang up nothing and made a note in a book, and that was the deal. Not everyone thawed, and one man did not thaw at all, and I want to be fair to him because he was not a villain, and the story is a lie if I make him one. Ozzie Trundy, 58, whom the Harbour called the Scale, ran another man's catch across his own certified wayplate rather than trust an honest eye, and he had watched the wharf girl haul her first few pounds to the co-op float, and he had not softened 1 degree. One evening she brought her catch in, and he weighed it slow and deliberate, letting it drip, and he looked at her over the readout and said the thing that was true and cruel at once. "I've seen a dozen of you," he said. "Come out here with a book of knots and a dead man's shack and a head full of it. Island's dying, girl. Kids I grew up with are all off to the mainland pouring concrete because there's no living left out here worth staying for. Every year, fewer boats. Every year, some summer person buys a wharf to look at." He set her pounds down on the counter. "You'll fish 2 seasons and quit, and sell that shack to somebody from away who put a deck on it, and there'll be one less of us. That's not me being hard on you. That's me watching my whole island go, one at a time, and you're one more at a time." And the thing is, he was not wrong about the island. He was wrong about her, but he was not wrong about the island. And I have stood on that wharf and seen the empty moorings that used to hold boats, and I could not tell him he was a fool. And here is the part I will not skip, because the story cheats if I do. There came an evening when she was close to broke. $40 was long gone. She owed the co-op, she owed Constance, she owed 2 summers of her life, and the first real cold was in the air, and her tank was near empty, and she had that day hauled almost nothing worth keeping. And she stood in the shack with a green and white buoy in her hand, one of Averil's, the paint still bright, the colours that every man in that harbour would recognise and leave alone, the colours that would let her drop a string tomorrow into good bottom nobody would dare crowd, and skip the years of waiting and earning her own. All she had to do was set them. Nobody living held that license. Who would it hurt? The dead do not fish. She stood there a long time with the buoy in her hand, and the answer getting easier the longer she was cold and hungry, which is how that kind of answer always gets easier. She had read his letter. She knew exactly what she would be spending to buy herself those years. She turned the buoy over and read the block letter under the paint. A. Sanborn. Redone across 40 years by a careful hand. And she thought about the sea coming up through his floor for his books, and the notch he cut into more breeders than he kept. And she put the buoy back up on the peg where it did not belong to her. She would earn her own colours or she would not fish. She was that close. I want you to see how close, because the ones who tell you they were never tempted are the ones you should not trust with a dead man's colours. That was the 5th of October, or near it. The first hard weather of the season came up the bay 4 nights later, and it came at night, and it came for the corner of the shack she had not finished. She felt it before the radio said it. The barometer in her chest, the way the tide smell changed and went flat and metallic, the way the gulls quit the harbour early and went inland to sit it out. Mr. Skoog stopped by the float at dusk with his collar up and looked at the sky in the southeast and looked at her half-sistered pilings and said only, "Blow tonight, out of the southeast. That's the bad quarter for your corner." He did not offer to help her, and he did not tell her to run to the mainland. He looked at her the way he had looked at her hands over the splice, measuring. "You know what the tide does off the ledge on a southeast blow? On the flood?" he asked. And she did not. Not yet.
She had read about it,
And she had not lived it, and he saw the difference in her face, and he nodded once, as if she had passed some small honesty test by not pretending, and he said, "You'll know by morning," and went home to his own moorings. The wind came on after dark, southeast and rising, and the sea began to run up under Cobb Ledge Wharf and shoulder at the pilings she had not yet made sound. And the whole shack took the first big gust and groaned like a living thing on its posts. And out beyond the breakwater, the ledge she had never seen work began to make a sound in the dark she had never heard. The morning after came in washed and still, the way it does when a southeast blow has worn itself out in the dark and gone off up the bay to trouble somebody else. Grey, flat, everything dripping. The water lay oily and quiet against the pilings, as if it had done nothing at all in the night, which is the water's oldest lie. Paige came out onto the wharf at first light in the cracked oilskin Constance had sold her on account, and she walked the shack slow, the way you walk a body after a bad fall, touching it, checking for what had let go. She knew the answer to the old man's question now, and she had not gotten it from a book. She had asked Mr. Skoog what the tide did off the ledge on a southeast flood, and he had refused to shorten it into a sentence, and the sea had spent the whole night teaching her instead. On the flood, with the wind driving up out of the southeast, the tide comes over Cobb Ledge from two sides and meets itself in a standing chop. And that chop hammers whatever is built out over the crossing, and the sound it makes is not a crash. It is a grinding, a low, steady millstone sound that goes on for hours and works at the weak corner of a building the way a thumb worries a splinter. She had lain awake in her bunk inside that sound all night, and now she understood why he would not say it.
You cannot be told that.
You have to be kept awake by it. The unfinished corner had taken the worst of it. She got down under the shack at dead low, in the mud and the draining weed, and read what the night had done. One of her new through bolts had drawn a 1/4 inch. The old punk sill had split further along its grain. But the sound sister timber she had bolted alongside it had carried the load the rotten wood dropped, and the corner had not gone into the sea, and that was the whole of the lesson, and it was cheap at the price. A shack is a system. She had understood the system just well enough, just in time, and the sea had let her keep it. She fixed that corner properly before she did anything else, and then she fixed the rest. And it took the better part of 8 months, and the money was never once anything but tight. I will not dress that up. She cut new sisters the full length of both bad sills, pressure-treated, and through-bolted them so the sound wood carried and the punk wood only came along for the ride. That was the easy part, because she had done it before. The new pilings were not easy. 2 of the 6 posts were finished, candy soft, and she could not pull them, so she drove new ones alongside. You do that at dead low with a borrowed maul, standing in mud to your shins, with the whole bay draining past your knees, and the clock in your head running against the flood. And you get the new post started true, and you drive it and drive it. And then the tide comes back for the crossing, whether you are done or not, and you climb out and let the flood settle the post home overnight, and come back at the next dead low to do it again. It took her 4 tides to set 2 pilings. She lost a boot in the mud on the second one and hauled it back out by the lace and kept driving. The roof she stripped to the rafters. The old shingle came off in wet black handfuls, gone the soft rot of wood that has quit arguing with the rain, and under it the sheathing was worse than she'd feared in 2 places, and she cut those out and sheathed the whole of it new in marine plywood, and laid cedar shingle over that, course by course, a nail set she borrowed from Gideon riding her hip. She flashed the one place a stovepipe would come through. She caulked every seam in the floor, driving cotton down into the cracks with a caulking iron and paying it with a thin roofing tar, working stern to door on her knees, until the twice-daily flood that used to come up grey between the boards came up no more. The tide still ran under the shack, twice a day, dark and quick beneath the planks, the way it always had. It simply stopped coming in. That was the victory, and it was enough. When she was tight against the weather, she painted her. 3 coats of marine enamel, a deep, warm colour she mixed herself and took from no one, worked on in the thin autumn sun the way you work a thing you mean to be buried near. Laid even so it stayed where she put it, and did not run down the shingle. She built a bunk against the back wall. She set the little second-hand wood stove Gideon had known of, going for the hauling of it, and ran the pipe up through her new flashing, and the first night she lit it, the one-room shack held its heat for the first time in years. She ran a freshwater line up the hill with the help of Constance's nephew. 8 months in, the leaning $5 wreck that no licensed man in that harbour would sign for stood square on soundposts, dry-floored, warm, her own deep colour drying on the shingle. It was worth more than every house the place children had been handed, and now a person standing on the wharf could see it, where before you had only my word. Her hands had changed by then, and that is how you read the 8 months on her, rather than on a calendar. They had gone hard across the palm and thick at the knuckle, split and healed at the tips, the hands of somebody who splices wet 3-strand in cold weather without thinking about it. She was 19 that spring. She stood differently on a moving float, and the harbour, without a soul announcing it, had begun to leave off calling her the Doughty girl. The 2 summers of unpaid work she paid out to the last hour, across 2 full seasons of bait and sorting and hauling on the co-op's schedule, whatever the day needed, until the morning Dolores Calderwood turned the ledger around on the counter so Paige could see her own name with the line struck clean through it. Square, Dolores said. That was the whole ceremony, which was how that woman had done everything from the first $5 offer on. She paid Constance Webber at Christmas, cash on the counter of the general store up the hill. "Pay me at Christmas," Constance had said the day she sold her the oilskin. "If you're still here at Christmas." Paige counted it out, and Constance made a note in her book and looked at her a moment and said, "You're still here," which from her was a whole speech. The bait and rope she'd run against the co-op's book that first hungry month she paid down too. She owed no one on that island. For a girl who had come across on the ferry with $40 and a garbage bag, owing nobody was its own kind of money. Then she did the thing the letter had told her to do, and left undone the thing it had told her to leave. She registered her own boy colours. She sat with Dolores and the state forms and chose a pattern the water could read in fog. Hers, and no one's before her, filed to her own apprentice license. And Averil Sanborn's colours, the green and white with the red top, stayed up on the peg by the door, where she had first hung the bundle, kept and never set. The boys in the rafters are yours to keep, but not to set, he had written, quiet and careful, a man who checked his gauge against the warden's own. She kept them. She looked at them most mornings, and she painted her own and put those in the water. Ozzy Trundy came round by degrees, and only degrees, because a man like that does not turn over all at once, and you would not trust it if he did. He had told her flat, that first fall, that she would fish 2 seasons and quit, and sell out to somebody from away. She fished the first winter instead. Ice in the cove, the ferry cancelling on the bad days, the stove going day and night, the short hauls, and the mornings it did not pay to go, and she went anyway. And one morning, near the end of that winter, she brought her catch to the co-op float, and Ozzy weighed it, the same slow, deliberate way he weighed everything, letting it drip, and he set the pounds down and said, without looking up, "You're still here." The same 3 words the storewoman had used, and out of Ozzy they cost more to say. Then he gave her the thing that was, from him, a coronation. Sanborn kept a good string off that ledge, he said. He had set her, out loud, on his own wharf, in the same breath as the dead man whose books she'd found under the floor. He went back to his scale. He did not smile. He never learned how. But he stopped saying she would quit. Tobias Lund, who sterned for one of the bigger boats and had taught her to swing a trap onto the rail in one motion, took to running his skiff over to Cobb Ledge on slack afternoons just to sit on her sanded bench and drink her coffee and argue about nothing, which is what a friend is, and she had not had one, and it was not a small thing to her, though she would not have said so. The apprentice road is real, and it is long, and I should lay it out plainly, because the romance of the thing hides the ledger underneath. In Maine, you do not buy a license and drop traps. You apprentice, logging days and years as a sternman under licensed captains, on a student license with a hard cap on your traps, and then you wait. Because the harbours are zoned and the licenses are limited, and when the list is full, you stand at the bottom of it, behind everyone who came before you. That wait can run years. In a tight harbour, it can run the better part of a decade. She was at the very bottom of it, and she would be for a long while. And that is the part the postcard never shows you. Vinalhaven is a real island, and it works for its living, and I want to set it honestly beside the story. About 1,200 souls winter there, give or take, and fewer at most every census, out on the granite in Penobscot Bay, reachable by the state ferry from Rockland better than an hour each way when the weather lets it run at all. Lobster is most of what pays, and Ozzy was not wrong on the float that first evening when he told her the island was dying. The young do leave. The ferry runs heavier one way than the other. Every few years, a working wharf gets bought to be looked at instead of worked, and a boat comes off its mooring and does not go back. He had watched it his whole life, and he was frightened the right way, for the place and not himself. A man can be entirely right about the tide and dead wrong about the one swimmer in it. The year came round, and out there you count the year by ice, not by any calendar. It came into the cove in January, a skin first, then a shelf the harbour worked around. Ice out came in a soft week of April, the shelf going grey and honeycombed, and then simply gone one morning as though it had never been. The eiders came back to the ledge. The harbour seals hauled out on the low rocks to lie in the thin sun with their tails curled up like commas. That was the spring she set her own string for the first time, under her own colours, off good bottom Mr. Skoog had allowed was hers to try. She ran the first buoy over the rail and watched it ride the swell and settle and sit there, saying her name to anyone on the water who could read paint. Then she hauled the first trap of it herself, gaffed the buoy, threw the line over the hauler, let the block do the lifting, caught the pot on the rail, and swung it aboard in one motion, smooth, the way Tobias had drilled into her with an empty trap on the wharf, until her back learned it. A heron was working the shallows off the wharf that morning, standing on its one leg the way they do. It watched her haul and did not spook, and after a while it went back to its own fishing, which is the island's way of telling you that you belong on the water. The birds have stopped counting you as weather. She kept a notebook now. Not a tin, a notebook, oilcloth covered against the wet, and she kept it the way the old man had kept his, because the form was good, and she saw no reason to invent a worse one. Date. Traps hauled. Pounds, written out in words. The price that week. The weather in a few plain words. Where the ice stood and the morning it went. And once in a while, not every page, a line down at the bottom that had nothing to do with arithmetic. She was not copying his book. She was keeping the next volume of it. There is a difference, and she knew it, and it mattered to her. Inside the front cover, where her eye would fall every time she opened it, on a cold float with wet hands, she had copied one line out of his letter in her own square hand. Not the part about the colours, the last part. Leave the next one better than the roof I left you. She read it most mornings without meaning to, the way you read a thing that lives where you look. Word of the Tim got around, the way anything does on an island, and it reached Ruth Ames, who keeps the collections at the Vinalhaven Historical Society, a real place on that island where the memory of the fishery is kept against forgetting. Ruth came out to Cobledge Wharf on a spring afternoon and sat on the sanded bench and turned Averil Sanborn's pages with the care of a woman used to paper that wants to come apart. 19 years of one careful man's catch, 1962 to 1981, pounds and prices and the weather in 4 words, and now and then a line that was not about lobster at all. This is the fishery, Ruth said, quiet. This is the part nobody writes down. The society kept a small fund for exactly this kind of work, the local knowledge that dies with the man unless someone sets it down, and they arranged a modest stipend for Paige to transcribe and annotate the records over the following winter. She did not give the tin away. She let it be photographed and copied for the archive so it would outlast the metal, and the tin itself went under glass at the society, and that was the arrangement. The stipend was not much. It bought a winter's fuel and a rebuilt hauler motor, and for once, a little ahead. She did not get rich, and I want to be plain about that, because the shore likes these to end with her name on a transom and a house on the hill, and that is not what happened. What happened is, she came to enough, carefully managed, on the water, in her own place, under her own colours, on the bottom rung of a hard trade with a long line still ahead of her. There was no lottery in it, a stipend, a paid debt, a dry floor, and a name the harbour had learned to leave alone. On that island, that is not a small ending. That is most of what anyone out there gets, and more than most. Now let me stand back from her a moment, because I have spent a long time close in, and tell you what I see when I look at the whole of it. She bought a wreck for $5 because it was the one thing on Earth nobody would take back from her. And inside the wreck was the thing that turned out to be worth having. And it was never the building, and it was never the bright boys she could have sold, or worse, set as her own, to skip the years of waiting. It was a working line off a good ledge. It was 19 years of records kept bone dry in a tea tin, under a floor the sea flooded twice a day. It was a dead man's hard-won knowledge, and his trust passed down through the floorboards to whoever proved they would carry it square. The state gave the place children houses and last names to keep, and I do not begrudge them a single board of it. But no one can be signed into what Avril Sanborn left in that shack. It is not that kind of inheritance. You do not receive it at a table with a caseworker and a pen. You receive it by coming out on the morning boat and asking the depth of the water before you ask for help, and putting the shorts back when your own tank is empty, and lying awake all night inside the grind of the ledge, and being at the end of it the one who came back and hauled next. The boys are still on the peg, green and white with a red top. The paint gone a little chalky now, kept and not set. A good man's name held up where the sea can never reach it. The flat granite stone is still under the spruce out back, where he carried it up on his own shoulders for a good dog, and she leaves it where it is and clears the needles off it every fall. The tide still runs under her floor twice a day and no longer comes up through it. I have thought a good deal about what she was really handed in that shack, and I have landed here. The things people fight over at the reading of a will are rarely the things worth having.
The real inheritance
Is the kind you can only be trusted with, never given, and you are handed it by strangers who will never know your name, on the condition that you hand it on. That leaning wreck was the best $5 she ever spent, and she spent the rest of her life proving the man in the rafters had been right to leave the floor locked for her.